I welcome everyone to our 9th webinar of the Human Behaviour in Fires group of the International Association for Fire Safety Science. And my name is Enrico Ronchi. I'm an associate professor at Lund University in Sweden. And it's my pleasure today to introduce you to Dr. Stephen Wong, is our speaker for today, that will present on the topic of human behavior in wildfire evacuation, talking about the challenges of data collection and research needs. First, I just want to give a brief recap of our activities. Human Behaviour in Fires group. Ours is a permanent group of the International Association for Fire Safety Science. As mentioned, we have a bit more than 300 members sign up to our mailing list, which is really nice. It is free. There is no cost involved. This gives you the opportunity to keep yourself updated on our activities. We record our webinars and you're very welcome then to share the recordings with your students or colleagues. We will provide a link to everyone that signed up. And we also have a YouTube channel. So I ask Arthur, that is the PhD student of mine that helps me with all of the logistics, to share the link here. So this is the YouTube channel. You can, let's say, subscribe to YouTube channel and be updated, and also maybe have a look at previous webinars that we had in our series. So we are now at our 9th event of our webinar series, and we have a set of ongoing activities in the domain of human behavior in fire. And this is led by myself and Erika Kuligowski, that works at RMIT in Australia. So we are a global group with people from all around the world. And also, on top of our YouTube channel, you're very welcome to join to our permanent group of IFSS to contribute or just to remain updated. So to get information about our upcoming webinars, activities, and so on. This is completely free. So I ask, yes, Arthur to put the link in the chat. So feel free to share this link with whoever you think would be interested in our activities or attend webinars and so on. As mentioned, there is no cost involved. The only purpose of this is to basically add you to the mailing list and have you the opportunity to be kept updated on our activities. So let's go on today's topic and speakers. So it's my real pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Stephen Wong, that is an assistant professor in Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Alberta in Canada, and leads the Resilient and Sustainable Mobility and Evacuation Group, so RESUME. Dr. Wong's research focuses on the intersection of disasters, emergencies, decision-making, and transportation, and works to create more resilient, environmentally friendly, and equitable transportation system. He is actively involved in resilience and young professional activities at TRB, that many of you that work in the transportation domain surely are familiar with, and evacuation research at the International Association for Fire Safety Science. So Dr. Wong received his PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from University of California, Berkeley in 2020. So I'm really, really happy to have you here, Stephen. So welcome. And I'm gonna now stop my sharing to give you the opportunity to share your screen, and as I said, really looking forward to your presentation. So the format is that we will have approximately 40 minutes presentation that will be followed by a Q&A session that I will moderate. So if during the presentation you have a question that you would like to ask to Stephen, please write it in the chat, and then I will present those questions to Stephen and moderate the discussion. So we can see very well your screen, Stephen. So I don't have anything else to add. So I welcome you again and thank you again. And I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. You can hear me all right?
Very well.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I'm very excited to be presenting this research and really just a collection of my thoughts over the last few years and the experiences that I've had, particularly in the data collection arena. And so I'll be talking about how to collect data, what are the challenges, as well as potential research needs. The needs particularly, I'd love to be part of the discussion and the Q&A. So think of that as you are putting your questions in the Q&A chat area. So again, I'm Dr. Stephen Wong. I am an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering, and I'm the leader of the RESUME group, which stands for Resilient and Sustainable Mobility and Evacuation. We are a group of about 7 students, as well as myself, that is working really much towards this idea within the transportation engineering space towards resilience and sustainability. I also work a little bit on smart transportation and also do some work related to electric vehicles and innovative mobility, and excited to be kind of doing that as well. But the predominant focus of today's talk will be my research on wildfire evacuations. All right, so just a brief outline. I have a little bit of context to just set the stage. Most of you will know most of the context, but it's still good to get everyone on the same page. The next is past data collection. I'll talk through some of my own experiences, as well as some research that has been done by a lot of folks, including some within this call, on human behavior in wildfire evacuations. I'll then talk through a little bit of my lessons learned and the experience that I have found and how we might be able to think through data collection. And then finally, we'll end with discussion. All right, so a bit of context. Most of you know we have large-scale disasters resulting from specifically fire hazards. And climate change is driving a lot of these large-scale disasters, though it's not the only reason as to why. We're, one, seeing a higher intensity and frequency of rainfall events, but on top of that, as well as heat waves and associated wildfires. At the same time, as you can see in this photo in California, we're seeing a lot of land development and in specific places along the wild and urban interface. And this development is increasing, so it's increasing the number of people and the population in these high-risk areas that are being affected by fires. And so what this ends up leading to is more and more evacuations, and specifically the size, and not just the size, but also the frequency of these evacuations, and even affecting places that haven't previously evacuated. On a hurricane side, there's been millions of people ordered to evacuate from multiple different types of hurricanes in the last 5 years. But on the wildfire space, there's also been a lot of really large-scale evacuations. The Fort McMurray fires in 2016 in Canada, as well as California wildfires between 2017 and 2019. That specific one of 1.545 million people ordered to evacuate was some of the research that I conducted while I was at Berkeley doing my PhD. And then, of course, most recently, the really tragic fires in Maui in just a few months ago, where 13,000 people were ordered to evacuate. Now, we've also seen a large number of evacuations in Canada. The 2023 wildfire season has been particularly bad within the Canadian context. In May, which kicked off the season in Alberta, which is where I'm based, we saw about 30,000 people ordered to evacuate, mostly from smaller communities and towns, as well as First Nations. Followed by that, we saw significant evacuations in Quebec, Nova Scotia, as well as in BC and major cities such as Kelowna and Kamloops and Osoyoos. But what was really quite incredible was the evacuations of Yellowknife, which is the capital of the Northwest Territories, where we saw the entire city, about 20,000 people, evacuate. This is a very long distance evacuation as well, as people had to travel multiple hours to the nearest town. It was bordering on 10 to 20 hours, depending on where you were going in terms of car travel. So it was a really challenging evacuation to do. Now, all this leads to some critical challenges that we continue to face, and really what sets up why we need to collect data. And this comes from my dissertation, and these are not the only challenges that exist for evacuations, but these are the primary ones that we should probably be thinking about, and this is the ones I think about from a transportation angle. I want to clarify that. The first is we still struggle with non-compliance to mandatory evacuation orders. And this really means is that when we give mandatory evacuation orders, people don't necessarily leave, or alternatively, people might not comply because they don't even get a mandatory evacuation order in the first place. So this presents a challenge moving forward because it's a life safety issue. The second is we have congestion and traffic that result from evacuations, especially as people are loading onto the road network all at the same time. I like to think of this as the peak of the peak, where you have a peak commute patterns, but then on top of that, much more people are trying to move onto the road network. And so there's a number of transportation issues that arise from this, then, as well as responses that need to happen from government agencies, as well as individuals. And the third is a lack of equitable outcomes. And this presents a challenge moving forward, particularly for underserved populations and disadvantaged populations that are often the most affected by wildfire evacuations and the ones to be most at risk. Think carless populations in particular, older adults, lower income individuals that might not have resources such as transportation and shelter to be able to leave. And so within these challenges, the kind of key question I want to ask everyone and for us to kind of frame our discussion around is, how do we research and develop strategies and prepare people and governments for those specific challenges? Now, again, I'm coming at this at a transportation engineering and planning angle. And so from this, my thinking is first and foremost, we need data of some sort. I don't exactly know necessarily right now which data we want to go with, and I'll talk about that later, but we need data of some sort. And so that's really important. One specific area of data that could be very beneficial is behavioral data, because it is very informative, it's very detailed, and gives us a better sense as to understand the why of certain choices and who made certain choices in a disaster. And this can be very beneficial because it can help guide certain types of transportation responses. For example, if people want to evacuate more closely, then maybe we should place all of our transportation responses more closely instead of multiple kilometers or miles away. Behavioral data is also very rich, and a big aspect, particularly related to one of those key challenges, the last key challenge related to equitable outcomes, is that behavioral data enables disadvantaged populations to share their perspectives and their voice as part of the research. That cannot be understated. It's very important to gather that information, because otherwise we're not necessarily aligning our transportation responses in such a way as to meet the specific needs of disadvantaged populations who usually need the most amount of assistance in these wildfire events. All right, so that's the context. Now let me go through a little bit of our past data collection, both from what I've done, but also more importantly, from what the entire field has done. And so I'm going to start out with a very broad literature review of 3 different types of mechanisms we can collect human behavior data. This is not a full search. This is not necessarily, I'm not presenting on a specific paper, but I think this captures a good sense of what exists out there. So the first is surveys. Surveys are kind of the bread and butter for social science. They're very helpful for understanding what choices people make, and they're great for helping to understand behavior. There's 2 subsets of surveys. The first one is collection shortly after, as well as collection further after. Further after meaning about 3 months and onward-ish, and collection shortly after is more very close to that event. So close, such as Gradura et al. 2021, they were able to actually interview and survey folks in shelters following the Camp Fire in California in 2018. And so that can be very, very shortly after the event, but there's also a collection kind of further after. Note that these survey examples are focused on after the event. And so we're not talking, there's a lot of research that has been done on evacuation intentions and what people are expected to do, and we do this prior to event. What I'm talking about here in this presentation is all human behavioral data of how things actually unfolded after a wildfire evacuation. That's a really important distinction to make, because it's very hard to do the part after the fire and after the evacuation. It's a little easier to do it before, because we have time, we can craft our questions in a certain way, and we can go through that process. Now, surveys have different collection modes. There's online, mail-in, telephone. You can even intercept folks, such as those in an evacuation shelter. And then there's also mixed mode, where you do a combination of these different types of modes. Now, for each one of these, I'm going to go through a few benefits and drawbacks, because I think it's good to set the tone as to the fact that each one of these different types of methodologies are going to have great aspects to them, but they're also going to have drawbacks to them. And so if we rely on one, we put ourselves in a box. From the benefits side, surveys are great because they get very detailed information, but it can also be very broad information. It just depends on your survey questions. And so you're able to get really specific as to, for example, why someone decided not to evacuate. We can leave in different types of text questions, or we can get more broader data. Did you evacuate or stay? Just a very broad question. And so that gives us a really interesting data set that is moldable by the researcher. You can get a decently large sample size, which is great. And you're able to distribute the link quite easily, especially these days. You can analyze the survey data in multiple different ways. You can use descriptive statistics, discrete choice analysis, machine learning. You can even use content analysis or text mining. There's a lot of different methods you can use here. There's an opportunity for either stated or revealed preference. Again, revealed preference is what people actually did. Stated is what they intend to do. And they're generally, not always, but generally moderate in cost. On the drawbacks, though, is that there is some potential for bias and unrepresentativeness. This stems usually from the distribution of how the survey occurs. If, for example, you're distributing it through help from one agency, such as an emergency management agency, the people who take that survey are going to be very motivated to take it, which is good for your sample size, but not great for your bias, because those are people who are invested in that specific topic of emergency management. They likely have higher preparedness levels than those who don't follow that emergency management agency. There can be sometimes recall and memory issues on specific details, though sometimes if it's occurring within a few months, it's usually not too bad. Even a few years, it just depends on the event and the person, and there can sometimes be honesty issues. We don't necessarily know if people will respond honestly. We have to assume that they're doing so, but that can be something that is in the back of the mind of the researcher. There's intensive data cleaning, which can be challenging, especially non-responses. You may end up with a low sample size. That has happened to me. So the surveys don't necessarily end up always with large sample sizes, and it is very time-consuming to design. Surveys are a lot harder to design than you would expect. The second area of methodologies are more focused on qualitative methods and specifically talking to people. Instead of hearing what people say via a form, aka a survey, what about if we talk to people? And the two main ones that I want to highlight are focus groups and interviews. You can do face-to-face or virtual or telephone. There's some fantastic research from Dr. Tara McGee and Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen, which is this book to the right that really brings together a lot of these different types of methods into clear policy strategies and practices. And this is really helpful information for a number of reasons. So first, on the benefits, you get very, very detailed data. You get stories from people who have experienced the event firsthand, and you actually get to hear explanations of decisions. That is really the most beneficial part of these qualitative methods, to talk directly to people and hear the story and the process in which they took for specific behavior. You can develop highly tailored or certain probing questions to get at specific interests of yours, and it can help confirm meaning or reasoning as to the decisions behind that were going on in the evacuation. It is also really important because this is an equitable outcome opportunity. It gives us the opportunity to talk with underserved populations who may not normally take a survey or might not have access to the survey. And so this gives a real voice to those who need the assistance. Though there are drawbacks to this methodology. The first, it's sometimes hard, it depends, it's sometimes hard to conduct any meaningful analyses, especially from a more quantitative side. It sometimes suffers from low sample size. For example, you might not be able to do more than 20 or even 30 interviews. There are some studies out there that do much more, but it's just a time-consuming process. And as a result, the folks in your sample are not necessarily representative of the entire population, and usually very much not representative of more external validity questions in different communities out there. There might be additional training that is needed for moderation. I have gone through that training. It is very challenging to moderate focus groups in particular because there's a lot of competing people who are interested and want to talk, and they can also be very hard to organize. The last of the three that I want to touch on is big or bigger data. And what I mean by this is really collecting a lot of data points of some sort, and this is kind of the opposite of these qualitative methods I just presented. Instead of talking one-on-one, we're now thinking of more of it aggregately. And there's been more recently in the last really 5-6 years, a lot of work on mobile phone data using social media such as Twitter or Facebook, and as well as traffic counts in particular, and understanding this specific type of movement of people. Again, this is after the wildfire evacuation. There's different collection modes. You can source the phone data. You can use loop detectors for traffic counts. APIs exist to capture some of the social media, for example. And so there's different types of modes in which we can gather these data points. Over to the right is an example of a paper that looked at cell phone data points following the lilac fire, and you can see it's all scattered spatially all around. So there are benefits and drawbacks again. The biggest benefit is that you have a massive sample size, hopefully. You have a very large sample size, and there's a wide variety of analysis methods. You could look at it spatially, temporally. You could use other types of methodologies in machine learning or AI to analyze the different data points. It's relatively strong in accuracy because you have that larger sample size, and it might even validate actual conditions. Surveys get you a subset of the population, and then qualitative methods get you even a smaller subset. So if you want to actually know what actually happened, it's usually better to get some larger data to help validate these conditions. And it also might already be collected, because collecting survey and focus groups or interviews takes a lot of time. On the drawback side, there are some really important drawbacks. And I want to be really clear here is that big data is not the necessary way to fix all of our questions and to necessarily be the end all for behavioral research. The main reason is that we actually don't know exactly the reasonings behind choices. We just see where people move, for example. We see some of that movement. We might get a little bit of the reasoning if you get social media data, but we don't necessarily know why people did it without some of these more other alternative forms of data collection. We usually don't get demographic information. That's very rare to get it. You might get age, or you have to infer demographics based on where points are located in census tracts, but that's not necessarily the most precise way to do that. And it actually results in some fallacies that are problematic when it comes to our analysis. It's very hard to conduct equity analyses, and specifically because you don't know who is a part of these big data sets. They can also be expensive if you're buying the data, and sometimes every once in a while the data quality can be questionable. If you don't get a high enough sample size, you don't necessarily know if it's representative or not, and so that does present a challenge. Here's some other helpful resources just for folks on the call, and I hear there's a potential that these slides might be put in a report, and so hopefully this is helpful. There are some very helpful reviews on human behavior, these 4 being the most recent. I really recommend you go out and check those out. There's definitely more reviews out there, but these are the first 4 that came to mind. And then there's also alternative data collection methods that might be future research needs. So for those of you who are PhD students or students in here who are interested in other types of research directions, you might think of drone footage or other types of crowdsourcing data. You might think of aggregated phone traces, which is something that I'm looking at, as well as biosensors. That's also something I'm looking at. And so there's definitely different data collection methods that exist out there, but is really kind of under the radar and definitely can be furthered. So in terms of my own data collection, most of my data I focused in on surveys. So that's why the first one came up as surveys. I collected data from California wildfires between 2017 and 2018, 3 of them in particular. And the thing I wanted to note here is just the number of responses I got from these surveys, and the fact that we distributed it online through a number of different agencies, local organizations, and local media. So we actually got a decent number of responses, I would say, but the challenge, if you notice, is that we really drop in terms of finish rate. So a lot of people don't finish the survey. And then there's a lot of people that don't answer questions that we actually need them to answer, such as, did you evacuate or stay? That's a really important question. If we don't get that question, we can't use their response because it's as a part of the analysis. And so we had to clean this down quite dramatically and all the way down to 79, 226, and 284 for each one of these. Now, as a note, these last 2 are open access data sets. So if you're interested in getting a hold of that data, I can also share the link with you. I also conducted focus groups across 4 underserved populations following the California wildfires. I focused in on older adults, individuals with disabilities, low income, and a Spanish-speaking focus group that was all done in Spanish, which was really exciting to be able to do that and to really hear, again, the stories of folks and the challenges that they went through, as well as the ideas that they had for improving wildfire evacuations. And so you can see we had specific focus group eligibility, and it was for a specific wildfire and a certain number of participants. Now note, as noted in the drawbacks, is that this is not representative of the population. This really just gets us a better sense of themes and general stories and explanations as to why people were making certain decisions. You would need bigger data or surveys to better verify the validity of some of this moving forward, especially for external validity. So data in summary, we have 4 key wildfires along with their survey sample size and the focus groups. Note that not all of them have surveys, not all of them have focus groups. Some of the challenging, again, after the fact is trying to understand and deal with certain barriers with the data collection. All right. So that was a lot of background, but I think that was really important to note because hopefully for those of you on the call, if you've never done survey data collection, then it gives you a better sense on how to do it. On the qualitative side, hopefully those of you who have never heard of interviewing or focus group or don't believe it's necessarily valuable to hopefully see the value in it. Me personally, I like to think of these 3 as really building off of each other. Again, each one has drawbacks, each one has benefits, but when we start to put them together, we start to see a more coherent behavioral process, which is helpful for research and again, helpful for strategies for government. All right, so now I want to discuss my lessons learned. And so this is from all that experience researching within the space really in the last, I guess, 7, 8 years when it comes to wildfire evacuation. And I have 8 of them to share. They're relatively short, so bear with me as we go through this. So the first one, and perhaps this is very basic, and perhaps it's not very enlightening, but it's still important, is that disaster survivors are very hard to contact. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's dynamic and ever changing. Disasters are also not everyday events. And so in order to do the survey, things have to happen for us to then go find a specific population that was affected by that disaster. For example, if a wildfire evacuation leads to about 10,000 people evacuating, then you have to go find a mechanism to either survey or interview those 10,000 people, but you couldn't have done it necessarily in advance. Transportation studies you can do under normal conditions and you can find different groups of people quite easily, but that is a much different when it comes to disaster. Also, displacement from disaster removes people from the area of inquiry, which then makes it, again, harder to figure out who we should be surveying, who we should be contacting. If they're not back, how do we contact them? And so displacement presents a challenge. The second, and this is so important, is recovery efforts have to take precedence. They have to be first when it comes to our research. Our research has to take a backseat to recovery. Recovery has to be number 1. First of all, it's just people need to recover and people need to have the resources to be able to live again and to repair their community. That's first. Second, from a surveying standpoint, it's just really hard to find agencies and people to take the survey. So there's kind of a logistical challenge. So there's kind of 2 different ways. You can consider waiting to contact folks unless mechanisms are set up in advance, such as the one I mentioned about the Red Cross shelters, or you could work with panel data service companies to be able to survey people that way. But again, even if you're doing survey work right after an event, you still have to understand that recovery always takes the higher priority than your own research. And that's really important from an ethical standpoint and for also protecting human subjects. The third experience that I found is that incentives were helpful. Now, in terms of what incentives they are, it depends on what you're doing. You don't have incentives for big data usually, but you do have incentives for surveys and for focus groups. And incentives can play a few roles. It can increase participation and also reduce that opt-in bias. So remember the folks who just want to our emergency management prepared, They prepare really well, and if you provide an incentive, it might get more of the general population to fill out your survey or to be part of interviews. Incentives can't be too high or too low. The reason being is that you need to attract enough people, but you don't want to necessarily attract, for example, bots or a gaming of a survey, which can happen. And so you have to be really careful about how you do your incentives. And usually your ethics board at your university or in your country has a mechanism for determining if that incentives can be too low or too high. Now, sometimes you don't necessarily need an incentive, but it is particularly nice, especially within a qualitative interview setting, because people are usually giving up 1, 2, sometimes even 3 hours of their time to go talk with you. And that data is valuable and is something that is important from an equity standpoint. The fourth is that collaborative distribution, at least for me, helps me reach more people. And so I worked very closely with agencies and jurisdictions, community-based organizations. I encourage them to distribute survey links to their different listservs on Facebook, on their different government websites or their organization websites. And this allowed the data to go out to the survey to go out to larger folks and to a wider population. The other nice benefit of this is that it's a little easier to share your results because you just worked with the agencies and jurisdictions that are most interested, therefore they're interested in the results of the research. So it's kind of a great a relationship and partnership in order to see the benefits of that research directly back into the community. Again, it can reduce opt-in bias because it's really sending things out to the general population, and newspapers and news networks are very helpful in doing this. I would sometimes give interviews with different press organizations in the communities, and it helps get the survey or focus group information out. My fifth experience, and this is so important. Please beta test your surveys. This is so important, or as well as your qualitative interview questions. Beta testing is so important. It can be internal or external. I usually do it internally to my own research group. But the reason why I say this is I have made mistakes in the past. And my big mistake is that I did not check the data coming through on the survey. And even though it was a beta tested, I didn't check the data. And as a result, I actually had a few questions that were overwritten as people were taking the survey. So I lost about 1/5 of my data that was going to be a huge part of my dissertation. So the mistake, I hope I can prep folks here on this call to not make the same mistake. The beta test your survey. It also allows us to catch bad questions, especially in our survey design. So an example would be a double barrel question where you don't actually know how to respond. So the question, for example, think about for everyone, did you believe your house would lose utilities and be damaged in a fire? So this is talking about what people were belief and risk perception. So do I answer the question about losing utilities, or do I answer the question about damaging in a fire? You see how it's double barreled. I don't know if I respond to this one. What if I didn't believe that my house would be damaged, but I did think I was going to lose utilities? What is my answer to, high likelihood to low likelihood? I don't really know an answer. So that's just an example. It also allows us to catch any type of leading questions where we as the researchers are sometimes inadvertently inserting bias into our survey, and we're asking certain questions that we're trying to get certain answers from. So again, beta testing is really helpful. It also can help figure out if logic is flowing correctly, as well as any types of typos or grammatical mistakes. And to be perfectly honest, I still always have at least one small mistake in a survey and in qualitative interviewing, but in the end, beta test usually captures most of it. The sixth one is make sure you ask your demographic questions. And the reason why is first, it helps us determine who is being surveyed. This is from a specific survey perspective. It also helps us ensure that underserved groups are being surveyed, such as lower income, women, individuals with disabilities. It helps gather that information. And it also can help us better develop strategies that meet the specific needs of that group, of that disadvantaged population. So I'm able to, for example, run an analysis to see if individuals with disabilities evacuated at a higher rate or a lower rate than individuals that did not have a disability. And that's really helpful for us to understand and to be able to develop really targeted and key strategies for governments, and also to help individuals prepare in a better way. Number 7 is that any type of questions, qualitative or quantitative, is that you have to consider trauma that people just went through. Disaster survivors have been through one of the most challenging and difficult times in their life, perhaps the most one. And we have to understand that any type of our questions is that, again, research takes a back seat. We cannot be re-traumatizing respondents from a human subject standpoint, from an ethical standpoint in our questions. So you have to be really careful about that. In-person questions also really have to be asked with compassion and understanding, and you should be guiding conversations with kindness and leaving just room for people to talk and share their stories. It can be really challenging, and because you want to collect very specific information, but it's so important is to let them lead the conversation, specifically from focus groups, and to provide probing questions when appropriate. And this, again, goes back to that drawback of training for moderation for qualitative interviewing. It's very hard to do this. And to hear people's stories on losing their homes, losing sometimes neighbors and loved ones, it's very challenging to hear. And it's important when you, as a researcher, is to make sure that you're asking questions in a really appropriate manner. And it also, when it comes to questions, one way to kind of reduce that impact of potential trauma is also to allow a question opt-out when possible. I know this creates a problem for non-responses. I know that. But in the end, our focus should be on protecting human subjects first and then dealing with non-responses later. The last of my lessons learned and is really that human data collection is just hard to do. It's true for context, of course, beyond disasters. There's not many funding mechanisms. Surveys, you have to redevelop it often every single time. They're not systematic. There's a lot of steps to go through. Even for bigger data, there's still a lot of challenges to go through this process. So it's hard, and so keep going at it. It's not something that's easy. Don't let people tell you it's easy, because it's not, unless you actually have learned in doing it. All right, so into a little bit of discussion and kind of wrapping up this presentation. I've given you a lot of information about my experiences so far, but how does this help us in terms of strategies and policies? So behavioral data helps because in the end, from my perspective on transportation, is that we have to meet the needs of communities and people. And we can do this by identifying those needs, as well as specific strategies for communities. That could be either things that the researcher has developed based on evidence, or it can be things that actually people themselves, people we interview and survey, what they say that they would like to see. And in the end, we don't build, design, or plan in a vacuum. I don't know what if folks are from planning or engineering or from fire science here on the call, but in the end, no matter what we do, it's not in a vacuum. We have to understand human behavior. So in terms of how this data can be useful, I'm just going to run through 3 really quick examples of how it can be useful and what we were able to get out of it. If you're interested in the papers on this, I have a QR code in the top for each one of these. You can take a picture with your phone. And again, this will be recorded and put on YouTube. So my question is, what influences sharing of transportation and shelter resources? That was my big research question. And using that same human behavior data that I collected from the California wildfires, I was able to determine first that trust and compassion are really important variables in increasing willingness to share evacuation resources. And that was something that I would not have known if I hadn't actually surveyed people and asked people certain questions about trust and compassion and if they were planning to share their evacuation resources in a future event. The same study, we found that wildfire evacuation urgency might trigger sharing willingness. So in terms of sharing resources, when a fire happens, it's quite urgent, and we hypothesize, people realize that they're the only way that someone might be able to escape the fire. So they share their transportation, for example. We also found that sharing differences do exist between populations with different types of social capital. So if you are a low social capital community, one that has not that much trust or compassion for each other, you're going to have a lower sharing level as compared to higher social capital communities. And finally, we can develop policies that help cultivate this trust and compassion. And we were able to use this evidence from the human behavior, from our analyses, to actually craft a strategy for how we might share transportation and sheltering resources. And this can be helpful either before, during, or after a wildfire. So that's just one example. Another example is a different paper where the first question we asked in the paper was, how do different people decide to evacuate or stay? And in the end, what we found is that there was a group of evacuation keen people and a group of evacuation reluctant people. If you gave the evacuation reluctant people mandatory evacuation orders, it greatly increased their likelihood to evacuate. But if you gave those same orders to people who were evacuation keen, didn't matter. They had a high enough risk perception that they were going to evacuate anyway. So what this tells us is that there's actually specific people that we might need to target our evacuation orders to, such as previous evacuees or lower income individuals that might not want to evacuate. It also means strengthening our evacuation order language to try to move some of the evacuation reluctant people in that group into the more evacuation keen group based on risk perception. The same paper, we are looking at, are people's choices considered, evacuation choices considered jointly, and how do we go about modeling this? So the first is, the really key answer here is that people do make their choices jointly. People consider their departure time at the same time as destination. They might also consider their mode of transportation at the same time as their route, and this makes intuitive sense. And we can reflect this in our transportation strategies. Let me give you an example of that. So policy implication of that is we found that there was a joint preference for within county and nighttime evacuations and within county and private shelters, meaning friends or families places. What we can see though is that this can help us develop transportation strategies to improve evacuation outcomes. The first is that we can find that on the supply side, we can really craft highly localized transportation responses because people will prefer to evacuate within county, but also this localized transportation response has to happen at night. They have to happen at all times of day, which is challenging because agencies might not have people available to assist in that response, especially at night. On the demand side, we might have to do vehicle reduction or perhaps pre-positioning vehicles in nearby areas, such as where people intend to go, such as their friends or family's place, especially if they have multiple vehicles. And on the information side, we might want to just prepare individuals by identifying the best or the nearest shelter, especially at nighttime, they might not be able to have as much visibility. And so having that information ahead of time can be helpful. The last paper I want to briefly mention is on focus groups and equity. So remember all the focus groups that I conducted. The question we wanted to ask here was, can sharing increase equity for vulnerable populations? And we found that disadvantaged population groups did express a number of unique limitations as well as concerns related to sharing. And this presents a challenge for us in terms of how we craft our policy. So there's definitely some problems. And some of those problems included driver availability or reliability, if vehicles could get to the evacuation zone, what would the cost be? Would it be free to me or would it be expensive? And also, how would I communicate with a driver to come pick me up in the event of a wildfire? The other key aspect that we learned from this research was that some barriers could be more overcome through equity-centered strategy design, but more structural changes might be necessary, such as developing pickup points for public transit vehicles. And so that would be a barrier, a more structural change that you would have to make in your public transit system. All right, so I have just a few more slides left, and to just kind of wrap this up as folks are thinking about certain questions that you might have, so please be putting those in the chat. The question is, where next? What are our research needs moving forward? Hopefully you've kind of developed your own research needs. So you've been talking through this, but I have a few more to kind of prompt you as you move forward in what you're doing. The first is just evacuation directions more generally. It's gathering, and this is kind of the topic of this presentation, is we just need more data and we need better data. And this can help us improve our models, better understand community needs. And this can be really helpful for us. And so I hope I made the case for that in this presentation. The second is analyzing choices for other hazards. So the wildfire space hasn't had too many analysis of different types of transportation choices, which is what I focus on. And then other types of events like smoke events or power outages have even less on what people, choices and behavior people make. So we need to be doing this across hazards. Focusing on an equity analysis by gathering that demographic information is important, as well as doing a little bit more of that qualitative interviewing, and sometimes even pairing that with survey data or bigger data could be really tell a really interesting story. And then finally, implementing these results in planning. As researchers, we sometimes struggle with practice and practical application, and this is a really important last step that research needs to take. On the resilient transportation side, again, I'm a transportation engineer, this is what I think about. But these are some interesting potential ideas that could also go into your fields if you're not in transportation. This includes embedding choice making and resilience. That would be individual behavior or government decision making. Changing the unit of analysis, so you can do anywhere from an individual to a neighborhood, community, nation, and start to see how that unit of analysis changes. Connecting to different fields, so this is actually a great forum to do so. Some of you are not in transportation, so connecting transportation to fire science to other fields, geography, anthropology, sociology, and really making those connections. And finally, studying compounding events. And so the impact of wildfires at the same time as smoke events, at the same time as power outages, might be another way to go. So we're doing some of that at the Resume group here at the University of Alberta. We have a number of different work that we're doing here. And it's related to, for example, resilience hub design, as well as wildfire evacuations in Canadian communities and transnationally in Canada, US, and Australia. We're also doing a little bit of work on innovative transportation, such as resilience of electric vehicles, and thinking through how we can better use public transit, especially in a North American context. So in my conclusions, in the end, behavioral data can inform the design and planning of resilient transportation. And getting this data is very challenging. But in the end, we have to understand that equity and ethics have to be paramount in how we collect that human data. Subject protection is the most important consideration when we think about disaster survivors and making sure that we protect them in any type of data collection. And finally, research can really better meet the needs of communities if data is collected in a thoughtful, thorough, and ethical way. And again, I want to really emphasize we need to be meeting the needs of communities in our research, and that's really the practical application. So just a few acknowledgements. My co-advisors at Berkeley, at Delft, as well as some additional co-authors, Jacqueline Broder, my advisors, Susan Shaheen and Joan Walker, and at Delft, Casper Kors and Adam Pell. I also want to acknowledge the many organizations that have been affiliated as part of this research, along, of course, with the University of Alberta and the Resume group. The funders of the research, especially in the United States, the National Science Foundation, Federal Highway Administration, and State of California. And the many research partners. This would not work without working directly with community-based organizations and governments. And so I really want to thank the many organizations in California for assisting. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Enrico and go through any questions and answers you might have.
Thanks a lot, Stephen, for the very nice presentation. I think you touch many relevant topics for our community. So as mentioned, you're all welcome to write your questions in the chat. If anyone also wants to put on their mic and speak up, that's also okay, but please write first that you want to speak up so that I will turn it on. In the meanwhile, just to let's say warm up the question session, I would like to bring up a comment because I really appreciate the discussion that you had on the fact that the priority should be on recovery rather than us researchers collecting data. So my question is, how soon is too soon based on your experience? Because, you know, we have this kind of dilemma of wanting to collect data early on in order to decrease bias and also memory related issues. But on the other hand, it cannot be too soon because, as you said, these are really sensitive moments for people that have lost everything in a fire.
That's a really good question. And I think it sometimes depends on the disaster, depends on the implications and the context of what has happened. I think particularly when you have communities that have been really devastated by wildfires and you've seen significant loss of life, for example, you probably want to have a longer recovery time before you collect certain data. So I think that's one thing to think about. The other thing to think about is that there's certain types of data that you can still collect in some of these events that are not necessarily, that are still behavioral data, but you don't necessarily aren't talking to people directly. So that would be your traffic counts, that would be your bigger data, your cell phone data. You can collect those for sure, because it's not, you're not necessarily interacting directly with people and you're not hindering or affecting any type of the recovery process. So I want to kind of clarify that. So that is, I think, something you could do in the background before to get a better sense. And then I personally, and this is again personal preference as well as also what your ethics board says, is that I personally like to do it between 3 months to 6 months as a general rule. I do know research has done upwards of a year, even a year and a half, especially for qualitative interviewing, because people really can tell a story and go through the process, and that's really helpful. For surveys, though, I tend to go between 3 months and 6 months to try to kind of deal with those intersecting issues that you mentioned. So again, it's personal preference, but also ethics and just making sure that you still prioritize recovery.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stephen, for your comment, because as I said, there is quite a lot of also of variation in terms of let's say data that you can collect, but also of ethical implications that such data have on how you should collect those. Because at the end of the day, data like traffic data or GPS data, they're much less, let's say, sensitive than going on site and speak with people.
Correct.
So, but I don't want to do a one-man show, so I really eager to hear I see a lot of names of people that are big references in the field. There is a question. Steve Gwynn, you have a question? You can also put up your mic.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Steve.
Fantastic.
Go
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Stephen. Fantastic presentation. Really good. I really loved, and you sort of apologized for it at certain points for saying this may be basic or this may be unknown. I don't think there's ever a time when you can give too fundamental a response. I thought it was really interesting and useful. There was one point, you used the phrase, it was a question, how do we do research and develop strategies and prepare governments for these challenges? And I thought that was, of course, critical and fundamental. And Enrico and I have been talking recently about sort of the next step beyond that, which is how do we research and develop strategies and prepare industry for the government's response, right? Because obviously we need governments to put aside funding and to have resources in order to prepare and cope with these incidents. But at some point, there's also responsibility and activities from industry, such as planning and design and so on. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, because it's almost a more difficult bridge to build, I think. It's how do you produce tools and data that can be used in industry?
That's a fantastic question, and I have not really thought about it. So that sounds really interesting. The few things that kind of briefly come to mind is, I think at the start, if you want to kind of meld or bring in a lot of kind of these methods more easily into industry, something you might want to do is just understand, if you're working in a company, is to survey or talk to your employees and to hear what they have to say about it, because they are your industry, they are your company as employees, and your company probably wouldn't function without employees. And so I think that human side of it can be really beneficial for, I think that probably is the first thing I would say. And the second thing in general is, I think industry can sometimes, not always, but sometimes tend to say, oh, well, that'll happen maybe very rarely, I'm not going to deal with it. But I think it might require us as researchers to go to them and to show them that this is actually something you should prepare for and you should plan for. There are, of course, industries in there that do this when you have hazards on a more regular basis. I'm thinking like logistics companies or Walmart, for example, in hurricane season, they're always stockpiling and they have their own distribution networks during hurricanes. But I think there's a lot to be done there, and something that I haven't thought much about. So Steve, I think you should keep going with that. I'd be interested to see what happens.
Thanks for your answer, Stephen. And yes, this is a sensitive topic, both when it comes to preparedness of, let's say, the industry side, and also how maybe can the industry support the preparedness, because of course they will have resources that an average, let's say, resident or a transient person in an area don't have. We have another question in the chat, is how prevalent is their biased information, because people are worried in case they inadvertently say something that implicates them or others close to them. So to which extent this has occurred? I think this is a very important point.
Yeah, that's a great point. Really good question. I think there's a few things here. I'm not actually sure to answer you specifically your question. I don't know how prevalent it is in terms of biased information, but I do know of a few mechanisms we can do in order to at least reduce potential bias that could occur. So the first is surveys. Usually you won't have any type of implication because people don't put their names, they don't put email, they don't have any of that really identifying information. Now, obviously how you craft your survey and the ethics review you go through does depend on that. I think your question might be more critical for qualitative interviewing. So if you talk to, for example, government leaders or chiefs of First Nations, that might be something more critical to think about. So there are a few mechanisms. Is first being able to talk, I think confidentiality is really important. So any data you collect is kept secure, it's confidential. Your ethics review should cover that. The second is that I tend to not call anyone out by name, and usually your ethics review, I put it in the ethics to say I can't call people out by name or by position or by some other identifying information in order to get that information and to develop that trust. And so this does present a slight challenge because you might not be able to provide enough context for results that come out of it, but I think it's a worthwhile trade-off to make. It's more important to protect identities and to protect that information. And I think in general, it can help reduce bias. So that's what I would probably recommend there. You just have to be really careful in how you design your research. Surveys, you don't have too much of an issue. Big data, you really don't have an issue there. It's more, again, the qualitative interviewing. So I would recommend particularly Tara McGee and Amy Cardinal Christensen. They've done a lot of great work on focus grouping and qualitative interviewing that they describe their methodology, and they are really the experts in that area. So I'd recommend you check their research out.
Thanks, Stephen, for your answer. I think we have 3 minutes, time for one last question. If there is not anyone from the chat, I have a burning question, but let's wait 1 sec in case someone else wants to say something. Otherwise, yes, here there is from Prof. Kova. Very welcome. What potential do you see for integrating the different behavioral data collection methods you reviewed to overcome their individual weaknesses? Very big question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the key is the question that I kind of come with is how do we link the data to each other? And I don't know necessarily the answer to that, because you would have to make sure that it's somehow linked or that your survey is representative enough of the big data. And I don't know if we would be able to do that. Now, you're able to collect them independently from each other on a single event, and that could at least deal with some of the weaknesses, but getting the same person qualitatively and then survey and then big data, you actually can't figure that out because you don't know necessarily the big data linkage in particular. So it's a tough one. That's a tough one, Tom.
I knew that. I just thought I'd ask it.
That's totally fair.
Thanks also for the talk.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the question. And I mean, it's also a matter of expertise as well, because I mean, for how good we can be as researchers, try our best. We all specialize in different types of data collection, and but you know, organizations like IAFSS, organizations like this group that we have, Human Behaviour in Fire, is the type of opportunity that we want to have for us talking to each other, because we know that each of us has their own strengths in terms of research. So this is really a good opportunity for us to get in touch from, let's say, all over the world. So I'm very happy that, you know, we touch from many places around the world with our group. But I think this was a very excellent and interesting presentation, Stephen. So we thank you one more time for being with us today. And as mentioned, this will be recorded and available for everyone that wants to see it afterwards. I just remind for everyone that joined that if you know of anyone else that wants to join the group, this and follow our webinars, this is free for everyone. So I just ask Arthur one more time to put the links in our chat to both sign up to our Human Behaviour in Fires group as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. But I think that's it for today. So Stephen, thanks again for today, and we'll hope to see you everyone at our next webinar.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks everyone.